The day of the divorce was meant to be the final line, the moment when everything that had once been called marriage would be officially reduced to documents, signatures, and polite legal language. And she walked into that building, telling herself that all she had to do was survive a few more hours, keep her head down, not cry, not let him see how deeply the past months had carved into her. She had barely slept the night before. Not because of fear of losing property or money, since there was almost nothing left to divide anyway, but because saying goodbye to the idea of a life she had believed in felt heavier than any legal consequence, and her body had been warning her for weeks that she was carrying too much stress, too much exhaustion, too much silence inside her chest. He arrived confident, well-dressed, calm, already speaking with his lawyer, already acting like this was a routine inconvenience rather than the collapse of a family. And when he saw her sitting alone on the bench outside the courtroom, pale and visibly trembling, he did not ask if she was okay. He only reminded her not to cause a scene, because to him, her emotions had always been something embarrassing, something that interfered with his plans, something to be managed instead of understood. Inside the courtroom, the process began like any other, formal, detached, efficient, as if the years they had spent together were irrelevant, as if love could be erased by stamping a few pages. And she tried to focus on the judge's voice, on the words that would legally separate their lives. But her vision began to blur, and a strange ringing filled her ears. She tried to stand. She never made it. Her body gave out before her pride could. She collapsed on the floor, and the last thing she heard before darkness pulled her under was the sound of someone calling for medical assistance and the sharp echo of her name being spoken too late. When she woke up, she was no longer in the courthouse. She was in a hospital room filled with soft beeping sounds and unfamiliar faces, and for a moment she did not remember why she was there, only that her chest hurt and her head felt heavy. And then slowly, painfully, the memories came rushing back. The divorce, the courtroom, him. She turned her head, expecting to see empty space, expecting to be alone again the way she had grown used to being. But instead, she saw a man standing near the window, tall, well-dressed, his posture calm yet alert, as if he had been there longer than necessary, as if he was waiting. When the nurse addressed him, she did not call him by his first name. She said, "Your wife is awake," and the man immediately turned toward the bed. "Thank God," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I was afraid you wouldn't wake up yet." She stared at him in confusion, because this man was not her husband, not the one she had just been divorcing, not the man who had sat across from her in court looking bored while their marriage ended. This man's face held worry, real worry, and when he reached for her hand, she did not pull away, not because she trusted him, but because she was too shocked to react at all. "There must be a mistake," she whispered. "I'm not." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Please, just let me handle this for now," he said. "You need rest. Everything else can wait." Outside that hospital room, her ex-husband was demanding answers, confused, irritated, convinced that the delay in the divorce was nothing more than another inconvenience caused by her weakness, and when he finally managed to speak with the doctor, he was told that only immediate family could stay because her condition had been far more serious than anyone in the courtroom had realized. And when he heard that a man had already identified himself as her husband, had already signed the emergency paperwork, had already taken responsibility for her medical decisions, something inside him shifted from annoyance to disbelief. Because suddenly, the woman he thought he was erasing from his life was no longer alone, and he had no idea who had just stepped into her place. The doctors later explained that the collapse had not been a simple fainting spell, that her body had been running on stress and exhaustion for far too long, that dehydration and untreated anxiety had pushed her system past its limit, and that if she had tried to push through the court proceedings, the consequences could have been far more serious. But at that moment, lying in a hospital bed, she could not focus on medical terms or diagnoses because her mind was still trying to understand why a stranger had claimed her as his wife without hesitation. When the nurse left the room, she finally gathered enough strength to ask the question that had been forming since she woke up. "Who are you?" she whispered. "And why did you say that?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he sat down beside her bed, choosing his words carefully, as if aware that whatever he said next would change the shape of her day, her memories, and possibly her future. "My name is Daniel," he said quietly, "and I didn't lie when I said I'm your husband. I just didn't explain the part where we were married on paper only, years ago, when you needed it, and then lost touch." She stared at him, trying to process the idea, trying to search her memory for any connection that could make this make sense. But her mind felt foggy, and all she could remember were fragments of another life, a job she once had, a kind man who had helped her through a legal problem she barely understood at the time, and a rushed signature that she had never expected to matter again. "You helped me back then," she said slowly. "But that wasn't real. It was just—" "It was legal," he replied gently. "But it was never meant to be permanent. We both knew that. I left the country shortly after, and when I came back, I couldn't find you. I assumed you had moved on. I never imagined we would meet again like this." Before she could respond, the door opened, and her ex-husband stood there, his face tight with frustration and suspicion, clearly not pleased that he had been denied access until now. "What is going on?" he demanded. "Why is this man saying he's her husband?" Daniel stood up immediately, positioning himself between them without aggression, but with unmistakable authority. "Because I am," he said calmly. "Legally. And until her condition stabilizes, I will be making medical decisions." The ex-husband laughed in disbelief, but the sound lacked confidence. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We were in court this morning. She is my wife, or at least she was." Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not argue emotionally. He simply stated facts. "You were filing for divorce from someone who was not legally married to you," he said. "Your paperwork will need to be reviewed, because the marriage you thought you had may not have been valid." The words landed like a blow. Because what he did not know, what he had never bothered to verify when he rushed into marriage, was that her earlier legal marriage had never been officially dissolved due to missing documentation during the years Daniel had been abroad, a technical oversight that had gone unnoticed because no one had expected it to matter. Until now, the room went silent. Her ex-husband's face drained of color as realization began to settle in, not only that the divorce he had been so eager to finalize might be legally meaningless, but that the woman he had treated as disposable had another life, another connection, another man willing to protect her without hesitation. "This is insane," he muttered. "You can't just appear and take over her life." "I'm not taking over anything," Daniel replied. "I'm stepping in because she collapsed in front of a judge and nearly died from stress while you were focused on ending your marriage as quickly as possible." She closed her eyes, overwhelmed, the tension in the room too heavy for her weakened body to handle, and Daniel immediately turned back to her, telling her softly that she didn't need to worry about any of this right now, that her only job was to recover, that everything else could wait. But outside that hospital room, nothing was waiting. Lawyers were being called, documents were being examined, questions were being asked that could not be brushed aside. And slowly, painfully, her ex-husband began to realize that not only was his clean exit from the marriage no longer guaranteed, but that his entire version of reality was about to be challenged in ways he had never prepared for. Because Daniel was not just a man who had once helped her in a moment of legal need. He was now a successful investor whose influence extended far beyond hospital walls. And he was not the type to walk away when someone he cared about was being hurt. By the time she was stable enough to be discharged, the quiet hospital drama had already turned into a legal storm. Not the kind that plays out in public headlines, but the kind that unfolds behind closed doors, through urgent phone calls, emergency filings, and lawyers who suddenly stop speaking casually and start choosing every word with surgical precision. Her ex-husband's confidence had been built on one simple assumption: that he was the one deciding when and how their marriage would end, that the courtroom would mark his freedom and her isolation. And now that certainty was gone, replaced by confusion and growing fear, as he learned that the woman he believed he was divorcing might never have been legally his wife at all, which meant that the emotional control he once had was no longer backed by legal authority. And that mattered more than he wanted to admit. Daniel moved quickly, not with arrogance, but with the efficiency of someone who understood systems and knew how to navigate them, arranging temporary housing for her, making sure medical bills were covered, ensuring that she was not pressured into any legal decisions while still recovering. And what struck her most was not the money, not the comfort, but the calm with which he handled everything, as if protecting her was not an inconvenience, but a responsibility he had already accepted without question. Her ex-husband tried to regain control by spreading his own version of events, telling mutual friends that she was unstable, that she had staged the collapse to manipulate the court, that some wealthy stranger was trying to steal her away for reasons that made no sense. And for a brief moment, those stories worked, because people are often more comfortable believing familiar narratives than questioning uncomfortable truths. But facts are stubborn. Medical reports did not support his claims. Legal records contradicted his assumptions. And Daniel's presence, steady and undeniable, made it increasingly difficult to paint her as the problem. When the next court hearing was scheduled, the atmosphere was entirely different from the first one, no longer a routine divorce proceeding, but a complicated legal review involving marriage validity, financial responsibilities, and possible misrepresentation. And this time, she did not walk into the building alone, trembling and exhausted, but supported, medically cleared, emotionally guarded, and legally prepared. Her ex-husband barely recognized her, not because she looked healthier, though she did, but because the fear he had once sensed and quietly relied on was gone, replaced by a calm that unsettled him far more than anger ever could. When he tried to speak to her privately, She refused. When he attempted to shift blame, his words were interrupted by legal objections. And when evidence was presented, showing that he had rushed into marriage without proper documentation, and then attempted to dissolve it without confirming its validity, his narrative of being the wronged party collapsed. What made it worse was that Daniel's background was no longer a secret. The courtroom did not care that he was a millionaire, but the legal teams did. And so did the business partners, who were quietly observing how this situation might reflect on the man they were working with. Because in certain worlds, personal conduct is never truly personal. It becomes part of your professional reputation, whether you like it or not. Her ex-husband began losing more than just control over the divorce. Contracts were delayed. Investors became cautious. People who had once trusted his judgment started asking whether they had misjudged his character. And the pressure that had once been entirely on her shoulders began shifting in a direction he had never expected. Through all of this, she remained strangely detached, not because she felt nothing, but because something inside her had changed permanently after collapsing in that courtroom, as if her body had forced her to finally accept what her heart had known for months, that she could not continue living in survival mode, constantly proving her worth to someone who had already decided she was expendable. Daniel never pushed her to define their relationship. He did not use his position to claim emotional territory he had no right to. He simply stayed. Consistent, respectful, present. And in that quiet presence, she began to remember what it felt like to be treated as someone worth protecting, rather than someone expected to endure. Her ex-husband, meanwhile, found himself trapped between anger and disbelief, struggling to understand how a day he had planned as a victory had turned into the beginning of his unraveling. And what terrified him most was not the legal uncertainty, but the growing realization that she no longer needed him for anything, not emotionally, not financially, not socially. He had lost the leverage he once thought was permanent, and he had no idea that the final consequence was still ahead. The final court decision did not arrive with shouting or dramatic speeches. It came quietly, through official documents, calm legal language, and signatures that changed everything more decisively than any argument ever could. The marriage was ruled invalid, which meant he had never been her husband in the eyes of the law, only in his own convenient version of reality. But responsibility does not disappear simply because a document does. His financial obligations toward her medical recovery and emotional damages were upheld, and his attempt to abandon her on the day of divorce, while legally meaningless, became morally devastating when viewed by everyone who now knew the full story. What remained of his reputation did not survive that ruling. Business partners distanced themselves, friends stopped answering his calls, and the woman he had once treated as replaceable was no longer standing alone in the hallway of a courthouse. She was walking forward into a future he was no longer part of. Daniel never celebrated his victory, because to him, this had never been about winning. It had been about protecting someone who had been hurt when she was most vulnerable. After the legal matters were settled, he offered her something simple, not luxury, not promises of forever, just space, time, and safety, while she rebuilt her life without pressure or expectations. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to rest without fear of what would happen next. Weeks later, she ran into her ex by accident, not in a courtroom or hospital, but in an ordinary public place, the kind of moment that once would have filled her with panic and confusion. This time, it didn't. He looked thinner, tired, uncertain. He tried to speak, started with an apology that sounded rehearsed, full of explanations about stress, mistakes, and bad influences. But she stopped him gently, not with anger, but with something far more final: indifference. She told him that she no longer needed answers from someone who had already shown her who he was when it mattered most. That she forgave him, not for his sake, but for her own peace. And that whatever he was searching for now, it was not something she could give him anymore. He watched her walk away, realizing too late that the woman he had discarded at her weakest moment had become someone he could no longer reach, and that no success, no new relationships, no rewritten story would ever change that. Because the deepest losses are not financial, they are the ones you cannot reverse. As she stepped into the car, waiting for her, Daniel looked at her not with ownership, but with quiet respect. And in that moment, she understood that real love does not arrive with grand speeches. It arrives with presence, with patience, and with the willingness to stand beside you when you are at your lowest. Not only when life is beautiful, her life did not become perfect overnight, but it became hers again. And that was more powerful than any revenge.